All right, everyone, welcome to the department seminar. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our very own Michael Pritchard. Mike did his undergrad at the University of Toronto in physics and math, and then he did a master's at the University of Alberta before going on to do a PhD at UCSD at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which he received in 2011. And then he went to University of Washington for a NOAA CGC postdoc before we hired him here exactly almost 10 years ago in 2013. And with that, I will leave it to Mike to give us a talk. Thanks.
Cool. It's nice to be back. Sorry I've been gone this year, but it's really fun to have an opportunity to talk about this unexpected adventure. So I'm going to just introduce myself quickly for those I haven't spoken too much, and then launch right into what NVIDIA's Earth 2 initiative is. And we'll talk about some things involving AI weather modeling. I normally work on climate, but I'm working on weather now. And talk about how that's a bridge to some weather stuff. And then I'll conclude with some observations about life in industrial research, which is kind of different than academic research. It's been interesting. Yeah, so I've always had this research tension between being fascinated by global climate dynamics and why, how clouds are going to rearrange themselves in the future in ways that change energy balances, in ways that demand shifts of rain bands that matter to people and things that matter to people. And I find those interests usually intersect on this obsession with confronting turbulence with computers. We live in a turbulent boundary layer, and there's lots of problems with the way that turbulent processes are represented. And yeah, I guess I think of myself as a bit of a computer nerd. I'm obsessed with the computational problem in climate modeling. I like to explore big supercomputers around the country, because we have such a horsepower-limited problem. We're trying to do something audacious, simulating 8 to 10 orders of magnitude in space and time. And my reminder of this on my commute is always the stratocumulus decks that we live next to. Those are delicate turbulent systems, and how they change with warming is a multi-trillion-dollar question. It comes down to the details of cloud forming eddies on subkilometer scales that we don't appear to be able to resolve computationally. So yeah, I want to emphasize the computational challenge here, which is on the left, that's a deep cumulonimbus cloud. It's the largest scale of vertical mixing in the atmosphere, and it's an exciting time for the world has just figured out how to cover the entire planet with that much resolution, and we have things called global cloud resolving models now that not only barely resolve this largest scale of vertical mixing. Now on the right-hand side are shallow clouds and the length scales involved in forming those, and you can see it's tens of thousands times more compute intensive to simulate those, and so it just seems computationally out of reach right now. It's very unsatisfying. Because that should keep us up at night. I mentioned we live in a turbulent boundary layer, how plants' physiology response to climate change will be processed by boundary layer turbulence in ways that redistribute water in watersheds. And I mentioned low clouds, whether they shrink like ice sheets, exposing darker surfaces, and amplify all future hazard, or whether they thicken up and buffer future hazard is still very uncertain, and especially when aerosols get involved. And then if you think about planetary climate dynamics, the details of mixing between the free troposphere and the planetary boundary layer matter. This is kind of a plot of compute normally. If you look at where the Earth is where we are today, sort of operational climate simulations, about 25-kilometer horizontal resolution, 10-minute time steps. We can do that operationally at large enough scales, explore enough scenarios, explore enough structural uncertainty, explore enough independent modeling assumptions to get a sense of the error bounds. Global cloud resolving modeling I mentioned is tens of thousands times more compute. We can just barely do that today. We can squeeze out 1-year simulations. But we're far from being able to do satisfying intercomparison projects. And then I mentioned the stratocumulus problem, it's billions of compute aware. And so for the last decade here, I've tried to cope with this problem using a multi-scale simulation algorithm method, which is just a way to sidestep a lot of the computational problems by, instead of putting high resolution everywhere, just limiting it to small local regions and accepting some idealizations like two-dimensionality and locality that allow you to capture some of the important terms in the equations it seems like you can't afford, and the resolution you seem like you can't afford, and look at some multi-scale behavior to challenge your assumptions about the approximations you otherwise would open with. Why I'm mentioning this is because that has turned out, surprisingly, to have been involve convenient scale exchange arteries for machine learning. Because what happens when you do this multi-scale simulation is that the interior dynamics are averaged in space and time, and you get a very low dimensional sort of vertical correction to outer dynamics that don't know about convection. So you can think of this local scale exchange about information that didn't know about convection on the planetary scale at coarse resolution, and information from convection that interacts in a predictor-corrected relationship to create a multi-scale planet simulation. So yeah, this is part of my story of how I came to NVIDIA, because this approach interests me. With the latest generation of GPU supercomputers, we're beginning to be able to resolve flow clouds from there on 10. There's doing work there on that, I can tell you more about it, and it's also been the path to machine learning. So that began with asking whether we could replace the explicit calculations of high-resolution physics with dumb sheets of digital neurons, sort of riding on the coattails of the amazing things happening in deep learning for image recognition and other problems. So that image in the middle is actually produced by a neural network, a generative neural network that can learn the relationship between concepts expressed in text and generate images for you. The kind of machine learning I did was much cruder, just very simple neural networks, feed-forward neural networks, that are trying to take the inputs to superparameterization, vertical profiles for temperature and moisture that have not experienced convection, and map them to the outputs of superparameterization, the tendencies of those same state variables that reflect how convection moves heat vertically and moisture vertically, and how it interacts with radiation. So you can do that with physics and spend a lot of compute, or you can just create lots of samples and try to do it with AI. So this leverages the fact that deep learning is this method to just do regression in very high dimensions, part of the reason that's very approachable today has to do with hardware and software that have come from tech companies that make it quite simple to code up and try things. So back about 5 or 6 years ago, we asked whether we could take a simple aquaplanet test bed, no continents, a simple test bed, and just run a simulation, millions of samples of these input output pairs from the expensive simulation, train a neural network. And at first, very skeptical that this should work because it was just curve fitting, right? And you should not test curve fitting. Everyone knows that if you fit a polynomial to a set of data, it's completely untrustworthy beyond the bounds of the data, and it's imperfect, right? And it's not going to conserve energy and things like that. But I gradually became very interested in this just from the empirical results. And this is the first one in 2018. This shows you the quality of that fit in the offline scale. You're looking at a pressure latitude section, and the blue colors are where the fit seemed okay. Over 70% variance explained in important parts of the atmosphere, in the mid-troposphere, in the intertropical convergence zone, and the extratropical storm tracks, where we know that convective heating couples importantly to the circulations. So that intrigued me, but the more important test is to there's obviously a lot of poor fit on this graph as well, right? And can those imperfections, do they destroy your ability to run climate simulations or not? And so this is the result that really stuck with me. What you're looking at here is a rich summary of the spatiotemporal variations of the tropical atmosphere expressed in a 2D Fourier transform. Time scale on the y-axis, slower at the top, faster at the bottom, or sorry, other way around, faster at the top, slower at the bottom. Big stuff in the middle, small stuff at the edges, eastward moving stuff positive, westward moving stuff negative. And the line, the bright line there on the left in the ground truth data from the expensive simulation just summarizes how all the equatorial wave modes that couple with convection are moving. These are their spectral characteristics, they're dispersion relationships. And the middle panel shows the same thing happening in a cool climate model that's ripped out all the superparameter space and replaced them all with inferences of the neural network. And despite the imperfections, the simulation's hanging together the same kind of tropical waves, and it's behaving okay. So this was possible at least once, and it got me very interested. And then some other credibility tests were passed later. We did it with Pierre Balder's group and Tom Diepler, and found a way to make this thing explicitly conserve column energy and mass and moisture constraints in ways that made you want to use it a bit more as well. There's still lots of unsolved problems in this category of work. We don't know how to do this reliably or reproducibly. It's frequently the case that the imperfections do thwart you and that simulations blow up in ways that are difficult to control, even on aquaplanets. But a lot of my colleagues are confident we'll figure out these issues and get beyond natural planets and realize some of the speed up potential. Many of those colleagues are now embedded in large foundation and NSF funded centers. The one on the left is one of my favorites at the Quran Institute. They're working very closely with GFDL climate modelers, doing equation discovery, parameterization discovery with data-driven methods, focusing mostly on the ocean, but also operational parameterization, learning parameterizations from high-resolution ocean simulations and trying to get that high-resolution physics into operational climate simulation ahead of schedule. That's Schmidt Foundation funded work, and there's a huge army of great postdocs working on it. And the one on the right is one that UCI is involved in. It's a Science and Technology Center based at Columbia, led by my collaborator on the work I showed you, Pritchard. And they're trying to initiate the new field of climate data science, and they're working closely with NCAR and the CSM climate model, and trying to involve a community of data science professors and students in our problems by creating benchmark challenges and doing knowledge transfer and other things to scope at FDC. Okay, so that's the probably that's where I came from. And yeah, so now I want to switch gears and talk about what I've been doing lately at NVIDIA. So this all began just over a year ago, I think in November 2021. This is Jensen Huang. He's the CEO of NVIDIA. He founded the company. He's been the CEO since its inception and the crazy journey it's had. And he dropped a blog post that I encourage you to read. Talks about actionable climate information and digital twins and achieving high resolution and many things I'm interested in. And it sort of expressed a real passion for his company to contribute to problems in climate simulation. That's not new to the company because they build supercomputers, GPU supercomputers, including ones that people buy in the climate community, and they're therefore also actively engaged with proving how fast certain kernels that are very expensive in climate simulation, like advection, can run when you really try to tailor them to the actual potential of modern hardware. But this is a deeper interest in an interest that was broader, that was expressed. Okay, so I knew NVIDIA mostly as sort of through these DOE supercomputers that I enjoyed using because they made my multi-scale simulations able to have more resolution. I've learned much more about it since then. It's a big company, smaller than many tech companies, but all big by my standards, 26,000 employees. They are keeping pace with new AI algorithms. They hire a lot of computer science PhDs out of Stanford, et cetera, and they're innovating new algorithms. And they do a lot of scaling, so that they build chips and supercomputers as well as generate AI algorithms. They're well positioned to sort of look at the scalability and the performance machine learning of scaling very ambitious architectures to very ambitious compute models. They do a lot of visualization, of course, digital twinning, sort of a, very interesting scope of work. Here's an example of some of their integrations with science. So in biology, one can now discover COVID variants and do drug discovery by fine-tuning large language models, these sort of 100 billion parameter machine learning models that are backing the information from the internet. And they can be fine-tuned to learn the language of genomes and molecules and chemistry in ways that are actively used in the biosciences and in related cloud services in the company that generate revenue that fuel this research. And here's a specific example. This is the Cambridge One supercomputer. The industry consortium, including NVIDIA, working on topics like medical imaging and genomics and drug discovery in association with an NVIDIA supercomputer that's kind of tailored for this performance machine learning. But more close to our world, a big part of this, I think, interest in contributing has to do with work in a company that uses digital twins. If you build digital twins of factories, and this is happening now, people will build virtual factories, auto factories, that have explicit physics in them that you can do experiments on, optimize before you break ground. So NVIDIA does this kind of work with companies that build cars and many other industry players. It's a different way to think of physical modeling, though, that's really about AI under the hood to do the low latency physical model. And you can imagine building digital twins at lots of different scales, from the molecular to the industrial. There's digital twins of wind turbines, there's digital twins of cities, flows, and you can think of planetary digital twins. And so one way to think of what Earth 2 is, this initiative, is could you ever do something really audacious like build a digital twin of the Earth that relies on really fast AI surrogate models to give you a very interactive experience of climate change that could become a nexus for lots of plug-and-play applications, including human impacts of climate change, as well as backends that contain the physics of the fluid dynamics, etc. So just think about sort of a loose guiding vision. But if you read the blog post, a lot of that vision is inspired about humans appreciating their place and connectivity to the system, and being able to interact with it in a new way, and to explore things that matter to people, intervention and solutions. The initiative was born with conversations with a lot of people I admire in European climate science who are being actively moved from academic to operational climate prediction as part of the Destination Earth initiative. It includes Peter Dog. Bjorn Stevens has had a lot of influence on this initiative. He gave a talk at his industry conference, GTC, in 2021, and at Supercomputing in 2020. It kind of has interesting views of how this AI technology can help us interact more nimbly with our existing climate predictions. So I was lucky to be invited to help direct a little climate simulation research group inside the research organization after a quarter of consulting in the spring. That started midsummer, and these are my team members right now. Jay Pazak will talk about some of his work on AI weather prediction. Noah Brenowitz has a collaborator who works with Pritchard at the Allen Institute, where they're working on foundation-funded hybrid machine learning methods for atmospheric simulation, quite close to NOAA's global understanding modeling community. And Yair Cohen was there at the dawn of the climate modeling initiative at Caltech. So both come from kind of nice, mature hybrid AI climate modeling initiatives that I admire. So yeah, you can think of this Earth 2 as a guiding vision of this interactive climate simulation system. Maybe one day you could select a region of the planet, ask practical questions about impacts, get useful statistical guidance. So one mission there is latency, visualization and latency, interactivity at scale. The other mission is that system evolving to have more faithful simulations of the fluid dynamics than seem computationally possible today. So the second mission is computational, leading into machine learning to sidestep constraints that we figure out from more as well. Of course, the world's working hard on those problems already. They define those problems, and this is meant to be complementary. But NVIDIA has a lot of interesting tools. One is called Omniverse. It's this interactive visualization environment. They have product segments that a database of physics and machine learning that thousands of downloads in industry and engineering applications. They actively accelerate strong development models in their community. They have a product called Nucleus that's designed to be a digital twin kind of infrastructure that's being used in design and automotive to sort of build all the connections you need between the many data streams that monitor, that inference, and that interact with the digital twin of physical infrastructure. And they build computers like Alpha. But yeah, it's meant to be in collaboration with climate science, and there's lots of institutions that get involved in lots of meetings with people that are interested at ECMWF, at NOAA, at the Max Planck Institute, among others. Okay, so that's the big picture. Let's talk about some cool science. So I want to talk about a digital twin of the weather. The context here is classical weather prediction, right, which is this crazy computational problem. ECMWF has owns the supercomputer on the right, the world's best weather prediction center. Computation intensive because you have to do this stuff on the left, right? You need to make an estimate of your initial condition uncertainty and data assimilation, inference a bunch of physical predictions at as high resolution as you can to be faithful to storm dynamics. But you need an ensemble of simulations, 50 or so is the typical in a medium range system, to get this common forecast uncertainty and make a deterministic forecast. So that's solving physics equations, right? F equals ma for compressible fluids on a sphere, plus a lot of tricks to make sure that initial condition ensemble spans singular vectors that give it enough spread, and inject stochasticity into physical parameterizations to give the ensemble a good stochastic representation of possible weather outcomes. A lot of people. So what I want to contrast that to is this new thing that's emerging, fully data-driven weather prediction, which is just mining the products of that data assimilation procedure and trying to do machine learning video prediction. It's like predicting the next frame of a movie in RGB, which people do, but with many more channels than RGB, temperatures, pressures, winds at different altitudes of the atmosphere. So for machine learning, that seems computationally difficult because the input vector is very big compared to video prediction. And the other thing that's challenging is you don't have the whole internet of YouTube videos. You have 15,000 days of satellite observations, so it's sample constraint, and deep learning algorithms like lots of samples. But it's been proving the last year or two that this kind of thing is doable and can be stood up by even small teams of people within tech companies, and as I'll show you, predicting scale gains pretty rapidly. Here's a little history of it, starting back in 2018 with Peter Dubin and Peter Bauer at the ECMWF. They showed proof of concept of this, pretty low dimensional, about 6-degree predictions, 60 by 30 pixels. Lots of players involved, and the ambition is getting higher. So ForecastNet, the 4 has an OU and it stands for Fourier, we'll get there. Was NVIDIA's first version of this. Its claim to fame was that it was the first to sort of tackle the native resolution of the ERA 5 data, 25 kilometer. And that was a really big computational machine learning challenge to deal with that sort of input dimensionality. And I'm pointing out 3 people on the bottom there. Anima Anunkumar is the senior director for AI algorithm research in the company, who champions 3 neural operators at Caltech, and we'll talk more about those. Jade Pathak is the first author on the paper, the archive preprint that you can read about ForecastNet, who we're really lucky to have on my team.
Mike, is that training on the ERA 5 or the analysis?
It's training on the ERA 5 reanalysis.
Reanalysis, okay.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's hundreds of terabytes available, about tens of that are being used, sparsely subsampling the available variables, because it is difficult to use all the data. With the taken on regressive timescale, ERA 5 is available hourly. This stuff's being trained 6 hourly. Yeah, there's nuance in what state variables you select. We're selecting temperatures and winds and geopotential heights at a few vertical levels. And there's nuance in how you do the training and the tuning curriculum. So what this diagram illustrates is that there's in our approach, there's an initial tuning that's really just optimizing the mean squared error of that 6-hour to 6-hour mapping. Then there's a subsequent fine tuning that goes another 6 hours in the future as well. And that tends to help us get a little more skill. The architecture inside this thing is much more sophisticated than any of the crude neural networks I ever used. It's based on modern vision transformers, which do this thing called channel mixing. The input data is first parsed into patches that learn a latent embedding that generalizes the patch detail. The patch dimensions are 4x4 or 8x8, so you can think of that as the effective resolution downsampled from 25 kilometers. And then there's the challenge with these vision transformers is that they're quadratic in resolution. And so getting out to this full scale of the ERA 5 data is really challenging. And so the trick that's used with NVIDIA to deal with this is Fourier neural operators inside the transformer. And so that can take the scaling down to something more like n log n. And yeah, basically doing 2D FFTs in the north-south and east-west direction. There's precedent for these methods on test bed problems of dry neighbor Stokes and literature about them and some understanding of them.
Mike, is it happening simultaneously across all the linked variables like pressure, temperature, rainfall?
Yeah,
or are you doing it separately for each variable?
Yeah, there's lots of ways to handle that. In this approach, there's separate channels for the different variables.
Oh, but
there's ways for the information to still mix around.
Oh, there is. So
FFTs are being
So all is going in and then all is coming back out.
Yeah, all's going in, coming back out. There's an inverse FFT at the end, and then at the end of the day, you optimize on that map.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this is sort of a summary of the green lines of the things to point out, though. Okay, so it only takes a quarter second once trained for this thing to spit out a 2-week forecast on GDE, and that's a 10 to 100,000 times speed up compared to deterministic weather prediction. Which is crazy to think about. Especially since the skill is not that far off from the real thing. So the yellow line here is the IFS, the integrated forecast systems, medium range weather forecast scale for, like a 100-member ensemble. And you can see that anomaly correlation coefficient goes off as you forget your initial conditions, as you expect at a certain rate. And the whole game of weather prediction is to bump that as far to the right and to the up as you can. The purple line is where forecast net was at about this time last year. And the blue line is the gains that were gotten in just about a half year, just from tinkering with things. Things like the number of transformer blocks and hidden dimensions matter, things like how many variables you stuffed in matter. Lots of things can matter. Still open question what matters the most in the hierarchy of concerns, but very interesting research done here. But it's just that rate of skill increase that I think is shocking. Especially if you do, I mean, there's been quite revolutionary weather forecasting. This is the improvement in weather skill that have been going on the last 3 decades, fueled by data assimilation and more data streams and better algorithms. It's much slower. I mean, of course, all of that work is reflected in the assimilated products that are fueling this machine learning. But the pace of it is shocking, and the number of people involved. Yeah.
Do the machine learning approaches assimilate data in the same way that the weather prediction models?
You say what?
Can they assimilate the data as you go, so they're going to like a day or two?
That's a great question. Well, let me return to that. So here's one way to look at it. Error 5, they won't give you, Eastern WF won't give you their initial conditions in real time. They're very valuable to the simulated state. GFS, the US, the NOAA, they give you their initial conditions, their simulations within 6 hours. So it's closer to real time. There's a question about whether you can take something trained on Error 5 and then transfer it over to separate systems, but this plot proves that you can. That surprised me. So the purple halo is not bad compared to the yellow halo. The lower quartile suffered, but the median is pretty good. So guys, that's getting closer to a real-time assimilated state speed, but it's not the same as what you asked. This is kind of cool. So the top is the initial condition, and the bottom are predictions, in the middle from forecast net 96 hours later, and from the reanalysis 96 hours later. I'm going to focus on the lower left-hand part. It makes its own cyclones, tropical cyclones that don't look terrible. It makes its own atmospheric rivers that don't look terrible. I mean, of course it is, or else it wouldn't be passing these skill metrics, but it's kind of cool. There's blurriness. If you look at the left and the right, it's not as much fine-scale detail in the precipitation field. There's ways to cope with blurriness in post-processing through generative methods. Diffusion models are popular these days. This uses, I think, a GAN-based adversarial approach to kind of bring some of that detail back in. In this paper, these are LDML. This work is closely collaborative with researchers at Florence Berkeley National Lab, kind of work openly with NVIDIA engineers, and here you can see that they're starting to get closer to better percentiles in the tails of the precipitation through these generative post-processing methods. And it's scalable. This is something the team's really proud of because they've got these big groups of machine learning optimization engineers and deep learning engineers who know how to take these methods and scale them. And so they like to compete for Gordon Bell prizes and things like that for machine learning at big scales. And partly the reason they use these neural operators is that they may scale to very high resolutions in the end, and there's ambitions to train them on a global cloud developing model output eventually. This is just showing some very strong scaling achieved by the team on the training itself on 3 different supercomputers. Okay, so NVIDIA is not the only industry player in this game. This was a very interesting paper that was dropped in November by Huawei. They've got a model they call Pangu Weather. This is the same training data, a bit more of it. To your point, it takes a slightly different approach. It uses more of a conventional transformer architecture without Fourier tricks, so very expensive. And those transformers happen to also be in 4 dimensions, and so they're learning structures that are, 4-dimensional from the get-go, rather than splitting verticals across channels or splitting multitudes across channels. So a few differences in the details. They made a strong claim that they have much better than the ECMWF's high-resolution ensemble systems tropical cyclone tracker. It's a suspiciously large improvement here, so that's a pitfall. So this is not open source, and I don't know if this has been validated, but some other details of the difference there. And there was another big paper dropped by DeepMind, which was sold by Google in December, that uses a graph neural network, a hierarchical structure, icosahedral grids, and there's lots of details in this slide, but here's the point. They're evaluating themselves against these NWF own internal scorecard that they use to rate their internal model versions. And so there's a separate score for every vertical level of the atmosphere and different lead times and different variables. And the blue means they're beating them at their own game for over 90% of those field variables. And the left plot shows an interesting ablation that this fine-tuning procedure where you first train them 6 and then 12 and then further, which they pushed out to, I think, a 12-step window, it really is really beneficial for this kind of work. So yeah, one thing we're proud of in the NVIDIA one is that it's open source, like these other ones, and you can download it. The blue skills that I showed you are consistent with the latest repo. And JD's trying to curate that. You can play with it and run your own weather forecast, and including close to real-time ones that auto-fetch the GFS initial data. A lot of research here, and I think a lot of that research can happen in the open domain with partners. And there's so much research to do. This is crazy. It should blow your mind if you thought about computational fluid dynamics that you can generate tropical cyclones with a 6-hour discretization in time. That means you're simulating fluid dynamics in a new way. And the best way you can think about it is as some kind of sparse hidden layer dynamics that are being learned. And there's much unknown about those sparse hidden layer dynamics. There's much interpretable AI work to do here. There's many questions to answer. I mean, these things have barely been analyzed. What is the realism of the extreme events they're producing, atmospheric rivers, the tropical cyclones? To your question about data assimilation, I think there's many things that are liberating about this way of weather prediction. Massive ensembles are one. Where things run 10,000 times faster, you could have 10,000 member ensembles, and maybe you could see California mega floods at seasonal scales, very rare things, 1 in 10,000 things that are hard to sample. There's also the simplicity of it. You're free to put in things that seem difficult to assimilate today in weather predictions, like wind energy production, which definitely has information about the turbulent energy of the boundary layer, but not obvious how to use it to constrain your physical state variable. You can just shove it into the input vector if you think it's valuable. And you can also predict it on the output if you want. If you want to avoid the machinery of trying to come up with a physical model of your wind turbines and connect the momenta that you don't really trust anyway because it came from a convective boundary layer momentum parameterization to some impact. You can directly simulate things in ways without having to deal with all the usual baggage of data simulation potential. I think that's a really interesting research direction. There's open questions about how much these things learn physics. If we hit it with external forcings, can we hit them with Gaussian heating blobs and see gill responses? And that work is just barely happening, but I didn't want to climate sensitivity from the whole record. And then something I'm excited about is like, could they ever replace atmospheric, just like an audacious grand challenge, but replace the atmospheric component of a GCM? A lot of probability tests would have to be passed there. But it's really interesting to think of, and especially as we don't know the limits for how long these things can roll out, and that seems to be changing.
Mike, could you spend a beat more talking about what you were mentioning about how they're resolving these cyclones, for example? Like, what sort of physics could we learn from them, and how do you white box this so you can understand this?
Yeah, well, those are good questions. I think it begins with domain scientists holding them accountable to their level of skepticism. So I'd like to see composite analyses of events, the way that we like to composite events, and there's bound to be imperfections and iterations to achieve the full potential. But it's just a very little analysis so far. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer to your first question.
I mean, I'm pretty ignorant of the space. I'm just trying to understand how would you take something like that and learn the physics underlying what is.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I won't be surprised if these things start out-competing seasonal scale forecasting systems pretty provocatively. And there's big open questions about where seasonal scale predictability comes from. And one way to try to learn about that in deterministic models is to go to great lengths to build adjoint models that you can, once you find a source of predictability of it in the scale, you can go backwards and try to understand the origins of it. These AI models are differentiable end-to-end because they have to be trainable through stochastic descent. And so I think there'll be opportunities there to try to learn about things we don't know yet about, or things that are in debate about the role of soil moistures and sea surface temperature anomalies and seasonal prediction. It all has to come backwards though from like a provocative skill score that you believe that the real gain has been made on the skill. And right now we have an unverified claim about that on medium range time scales from DeepMind. I think everyone's anticipating, and just based on the rate of progress, I was there, like, there'll be more of that. And then the work going backwards and using that for understanding is something that may need to be taken up by the community. Thanks. So I only talked about weather here, but I mentioned that Earth 2 is a climate emission. So what's the connection? So one connection is something that basic that George Stevens put his finger on, and it's in this Supercomputing 2020 talk that really inspired me. He's grappling with global cloud resolving modeling at the Max Planck Institute. And I hadn't realized, but a big challenge there is just data storage. If you want to save all the details that matter to people, which are on the 5 scales of space and time, from a global cloud resolving model that's doing a century prediction, it's currently an exabyte of storage. And storage is more expensive than compute these days, and so our usual model is to save the stuff and looking at it later, which doesn't work, it's busted. And so Jordan was looking at just the speed of the data-driven weather prediction models, and it's obvious to think about things like really massive ensembles on the weather time scale and getting much faster weather forecasts, etc. But what he put his finger on is that that's also a way to reduce latency and add compression in global cloud resolving model world. And so maybe what you do in the future is just save information every week or two, and then use these generative AI models to fill in the gaps. And it's not necessarily just interpolation, it could also be extreme event sampling that we don't have right now. Because if you believe you're actually generating realistic instances of internal variability from these generative methods, if you believe they're making physics, then you also have better sampling of your tail statistics, compound events, worst case scenarios, etc. So it's an exciting vision, and I think that's the obvious path from this technology for weather to doing something helpful for climate. You can imagine doing it already today using the world's current libraries of CMM data, high resonance data. And then there's some new machine learning challenges there about, beyond the high amplitude signals of weather, can you learn these subtle, more nuanced boundary condition sensitivities of envelopes of weather to scenario forcing, discriminate scenario forcing, discriminate climate model structural uncertainty, etc. But it's an interesting vision to think about because you could have a chain of digital twins one day where instead of this ridiculously hard work of trying to mine the CMIP archive at the high resolutions, you're just inferencing it off of the GPU, and that's feeding into digital twins of climate, feeding into digital twins of weather associated with climate, feeding into digital twins of infrastructure. Real potential for low latency impact here if that all works. Eventually, we want to use higher resolution simulations. I don't know if this animation is going to work. That's a simulation result from a kilometer scale global cloud I'm talking about. I wish we could animate it, because it also showcases these awesome visualization experts' ability to make beautiful animations. But in any case, there's real interest in the company in enabling more of these kinds of simulations alongside this kind of AI work I mentioned. Because there's a problem. Right now, if you took Summit, which is the Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facilities, it was a top 4 system, powered by NVIDIA V100 GPUs, a single 1.25 kilometer icon simulation has been clocked, would take 2 years to run out for 100 years, while considering most of the GPU memory. And nobody gives you all the GPU memory for 2 years. And even if you took out all the GPUs in this thing and replaced them with our latest GPUs, that would take, you could do more ensemble members, maybe 6 instead of 1. But it would still take years to finish, to integrate out. So there's a big problem with throughput. A lot of people working on it. I just want to emphasize that because I think there's this other category of work that can be done, which is just about making our kernels fly on modern hardware. And there's easy to use compiler accelerators like OpenXEC that will give you limited speedups. But I'm seeing glimpses of what's possible if you actually design your algorithm with the full potential of hardware in mind, and maybe there's throughput solutions lurking there as well. Okay. So I promised I'd talk a little bit about like the differences in culture I'm observing about doing research in these in a company's research report versus academia. So let me spend a bit of time there before we wrap up. Okay. Wheel of paperwork. It's amazing. Grant writing, grant reporting, lots of things. But way more meetings. Lots and lots of meetings with people, kinds of people I've never met. And better run meetings, way better run meetings. I hadn't realized how much time I wasted. This is fine to see a nicely run meeting with good asynchronous note-taking and all the asynchronous stuff reserved for before and down to business, and they move fast. More emails. I was shocked on day one of full-time when I saw the rate of email generation and like the breadth of work being reported in efficient, concise ways at very large scales. Disorienting. Impact, that's an ivory tower. This is not. It's really integrated into society, into companies, into people building cars, people building windmills, people extracting oil, people sequestering carbon, people building, using supercomputers, and this real visceral sense that things are being stood up in research that are changing, like affecting people's lives very quickly. That's different. Having a boss, I didn't realize I missed that. This is my boss, he's the chief scientist, he's great. So you have a meeting every couple of weeks and someone to talk to and a mentor, and they've been extremely motivated about this. Really good. Risk taking. I gave a talk early on in the video where I suggested they asked me to present a vision of what you would do with extreme scales with hybrid machine learning. We're building off of what I described at the beginning about my usual wheelhouse of trying to build local emulators of systems of nested complexity and outsource that to AI. And I mentioned, like, it's very risky. There's all these things I don't know if they would work about reliable reproducibility, but the opposite experience of a grant review. It's sort of like, well, this is intuitive, but it makes sense that this will probably work. We just start somewhere, let's get going. And permissive risk-taking culture, pretty ambitious scales. But volatility and stress. That's the stock price. You can see what happened over the last year, like I haven't. It's very difficult for a massive company to absorb without layoffs. There haven't been any yet. This is lots of other things we need to pivot and orient. And so not just risk taking, but lots of rebalancing and fast iteration, road mapping. And I didn't realize it. I complained a lot about the glacial timescale with grant writing. And it takes so long between when you have an idea, when you can get the idea into the front end of a review pipeline, how long it takes that review pipeline to give you a signal, and then how long it takes you to stand up the compute you need after that. But then there's stability. 3 years of it. That doesn't exist in many places. That was an interesting feature of academia. Teamwork culture. Onboarding was really interesting. There's a real sense of culture that's being fostered, and values like excellence and agility and things that create a real team spirit, and a real team spirit when people are working on these projects and they have to pivot together in moments of stress and they share victories together. But you can feel the teamwork. It's really interesting. They all co-own the company, I guess, and are legitimately invested. Actual management training. Gosh, I could have used some of that a while ago. Scalable modules to train you on technical topics, but also on mentorship topics. Colleagues, amazing colleagues. That's an email I mentioned here. Some of these colleagues live in both academia and industry, which is very interesting to me. So these are two of them. Anita, she directs the AI algorithms, and she also has a group of students and postdocs at Caltech, and some of the students and postdocs take partial internships in the company, and there's some collaboration on some silos of work between the institutions. Likewise, Peter Fox is a part-time prof at University of Washington. And those are a few things we could talk more about, lots of other things. But yeah, I wanted to close with a few remarks. Okay, this machine learning at scale in tech companies is upending computational climate trade-offs in numerical weather prediction, and it's a matter of time for climate prediction. There's so many new tools. There's, I think, real strength in working together. I think you can see that in biosciences. And there's tech. So there's some tools I mentioned, Omniverse, Nucleus, Modulus, and a lot of this tech is available to academics. And there's opportunities for teaching missions that I'm realizing. I've been wondering, like I've seen these great people get great jobs in this great company. What would it take to train grad students to be competitive for those? I don't fully know, but some things that seem important to me now and didn't before were giving them real team experience and team software development so that they understood modern development operations and continuous integration and continuous deployment. It's essential to working together on a software project, doing Git pushes and pulls frequently. Being conversant in the modern performance data formats that are clearly the future in our field, the Zara-based cloud data formats for climate analysis. Is it the Pangeo stack that's emerging, the XMEP stack that's emerging? It's the future. And communication skills. It's amazing how these very technically gifted people who know the ins and outs of AI algorithms, how much better they are communicating with each other than a lot of people I've met in other settings. So these seem like a part of the Venn diagram. I don't know what the full thing is. And probably we need some kind of joint training in our department and other departments. But the opportunities for the research mission, there's lots of them. I'd love to be on with some of these tech professionals in areas where we have a aligned interest. I've learned that companies don't like to be hit up for money and GPU donations, but this company at least really enjoys working on authentically aligned research, with the main settings, and there's lots of freedom to do that. I mentioned there's lots of just interesting questions out in the zeitgeist that I think are great for students about the limitations of this new weather simulation technology and whether there's going to be a viable path there to climate prediction. And yeah, I guess I'll conclude there, and thanks for your time, and I look forward to having a little conversation. Thanks.
Questions for Mike?
Really awesome talk. Amazing to hear what's going on. For the weather part, I have a couple of questions. One is, at what point, so training on the ECMWF and the forecasting kind of takes this piece of assimilating all the satellite data and all the radio songs, that's a step before, right? You have to assimilate all that stuff, and then, so one question I have with that is, at what point do you actually become limited by the data versus the model? Are we starting to approach that point where, or there must be a joint limitation at some point where the satellite data or the songs are not dense enough? The other question I have is so you guys are almost beating, so will NVIDIA actually, have a weather service, or what's the goal there with the weather piece? Will you beat that? Will you have a business around weather forecast?
Yeah.
So there's so two pieces.
Yeah. So on the first piece, I think that's really interesting. That's a really interesting question. I don't think we know yet where that limit is, but it seems intuitive. They're off field of that you described. I think there are ways to do AI-based data assimilation that Noah's been thinking about that maybe more scalable. But I think
you're not doing that
some
problem yet. The data assimilation part.
The stuff, I didn't show anything about data assimilation. But it's an obvious area to be interested in, right? And these models are differentiable also in ways that could be beneficial for data assimilation, including variational methods that we're familiar with. I think I create ablations. Ablations are machine learning for sensitivity studies. And I think the scale of this problem has been hard to do really systematic sensitivity studies that really expose the data hungriness and limitations. And if you look at the three examples that have provocative skill, there's some variance in how much the Aero5 data they're using. GraphCast is using all of it. And he's using a fraction, and we're using a smaller fraction. And we're constantly changing what we do internally as well. So hopefully some of these lessons will emerge, and hopefully in visible settings to get to your questions. I can't speak to your second question. It'll be interesting to see how lots of institutions evolve in the era of their age. I think it's logical that this kind of work is so approachable that there's likely to be other services in the world.
So your division is more like research, and then
I was hired to develop a climate simulation research strategy, and and start to think about the path from this weather technology to compressing and latency problems in climate. But I'm getting entrained into the weather world, and yeah, there's not much to say. Yeah.
So, three questions, please. So, you mentioned Peter Bauer and his Destination Earth project in ECMWF. And my question is, now, this project started now, has multi-million of dollars put in by the European Union. So, are you collaborating? Is this a synergy or competition? Because we know ECMWF is a leader in weather prediction.
Yeah.
So, what is the connection with NVIDIA?
Yeah, we don't want it to be competition. We have a science advisory board, and Peter Bauer's on it. And yeah, so, but you know, my feeling is that government and academia are under-proficient on the machine learning operations personnel required to do some of the ambitious machine learning. And frankly, I don't see a way, based on how much they get paid in their equity packages, that any academic institution or even DOE national lab could sustain the support asset of a half dozen of those sorts of people that seem necessary to get to the scales of large language models and very, you know, the exciting discoveries. So yeah, in terms of complementariness, I think that's an obvious position. Yeah, and you know.
So, yeah, so you put a plot up there which had the improvement of the weather forecasts up to 2012. This is from Peter Bauer's Nature paper. This graph, I have shown it 10, 12 years ago because I was in a committee that basically assessed the impact of the modernization of the computer services of the National Weather Service in improving forecasts. So all the improvement that came in this, you know, graph was because they changed their computers to more, you know, up to date. So what strikes me is that the next generation of improvement will come from the computational power, not really better science.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of this as a form of computational power.
It
To the extent,
It's the next generation of computation, which is not available to us in academia, but it is to you or some other.
Not yet, but maybe we should be lobbying for
Yeah.
it. The NSF has figured out how to sustain expensive things like physical cyber infrastructure.
Yeah.
Maybe they can figure out how to sustain expensive things like machine learning personnel, cyber infrastructure.
Okay. And the last question, which is more of the technical. So we use heavy duty learning and machine learning, etc. But then I'm a little disappointed when we come down to validate performance. You saw two scores, root mean square error, which has nothing to do to capture an organization, it's point. And then ACC, the correlation structure of the anomalies. This does not do justice.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, the very first thing Peter Lieben told us, who's on our advisory board as well, was like, show me a CRPS. I don't care about your root mean square errors. Yeah, so yeah, I can point you to a preprint.
A paper that we have, my postdoc is basically using the right loss functions in a machine learning. If I wanted to preserve space-time organization, why don't I inject on that as a loss function the wavelet space-time spectrum?
Yes, and there's really interesting work out of Rice University with Ashish Chattopadhyay that shows that you know the log scale of variance, where the small things in the tail of the spectrum are so low amplitude that they're probably not being paid attention to by L2 loss function. You expect that to cascade upscale and corrupt your turbulence and to set a limit on the rollout time scale. And Ashish has this beautiful work that shows that you use a spectral regularizer to make the optimizer attuned to that. You can actually get like 17,000 day quasi-geostrophic emulations and impressive stability. Yeah, so I fully agree. Respecting the spectral properties is probably vital to get beyond the medium range out to it's also respecting the geometry, frankly, which a 2D periodicity assumption won't do. But there'll be results coming out to speak to some of these issues in the coming months. But yeah, there's so much mystery and freedom about the ability to have a loss function to muck with. This is something I wanted to mention, is like, if you're obsessed with what you care about in your region, say you're, you know, the owner of some wind hazard exposed infrastructure in the southeast US, you've got a terrible time lobbying with a central weather prediction agency to get what matters to you fixed. Because the process to fix it is to come up with effective momentum transport parameterizations and set up new observations, and then once lots of things that can go wrong, get that in the machine learning edge, you could just go and emphasize that, and they optimize that. And so please upweight the 95th percentile extreme wind events and retrain yourself. And it's an open question. I don't know if this works. Maybe it trades off against the weather still in the end, but it feels liberating that there's a potential for the stakeholder to inject themselves into what's optimized for the first time directly. Yeah.
So finally, for data storage, have you thought of using compressive sensing? If you're familiar with this, 10% of the data you keep is you reproduce the original with no loss of information. I mean, that's a signal processing technique, which is known, compressive sensing.
Yeah, I don't work on it directly, but I've certainly got colleagues. There's Stefan Matt here who's quite interested in that, and there you are. And there's colleagues in NVIDIA working with the exascale computing project programs that are focusing on compression opportunities. And this question about how compression could dovetail with input vector ambition in ways that could take us another step forward on mining the full potential for data record, I think is really, really interesting.
So one question.
I thought I saw Stefan first, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
My question is this, sorry. You had mentioned in the last slide that especially for grad students, like exposure to cloud storage and working with data that is stored somewhere and would be important, but how does that, is there like any formal structure that's working with the data from Earth too, or is that just like a general observation?
It's a general observation. I just think that there's clearly, you go and look out on your grad student radar, there's clearly modern seeming, less adopted tools that have an argument for their future scalability. And I think it's strategic to lean into those sooner, especially if you've got the assets like the Pangeo community taking the pain out of that you can plug into. There's a way, naturally, when professors have to do so many jobs that they're not likely to be able to stay abreast with those tools at the same rate as you can in your free time. But I think there's every advantage to just checking them out and being explorative of the national infrastructure you have available to you. Plugging into the open source communities, XSmith and Pangeo and great ones for that topic. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
So when it comes to comparing kind of what can you do well in an academic setup compared to industry setup in terms of research, and particularly AI for weather research, like a pretty frustrating experience as an academic researcher is oftentimes, that you don't have the compute, right? The tech companies are basically they're winning always the race. So what would you advise kind of academic research on AI for weather and climate should focus on as opposed to industry research?
So we actually view the compute as less of a problem than the personnel. I think we have access to, if you put your mind to it, amazing GPU clusters like at NERSC, at DOE, at down the coast at San Diego Supercomputing Center. On my university side, I think I got 50,000 node hours last year, worth $2 million through the Exceed network. So you can apply for this to the compute, but what we don't have are the personnel. And I feel like making the pipelines, making the, unclogging the data I/O limiter that thwarts your ability to train, sharding the data and making it be, training on ambitious data models. A lot of this pipelining work. And it's also there in that X-ray and the DAC and the cloud workflows, and so they're related. But I'm really curious about whether there's people in CS, maybe the systems or more in the engineering world that get trained formally on that aspect of the work. We can talk more offline, sorry, I'm petering out. But,
maybe we can thank Mike again, and we can have more questions outside with the topic.